Um, Thank you. I think I'm the graveyard slot on a Wednesday, so thank you for turning up. It is very rare that I get to speak about myself for half an hour without having to pay someone. So what I will do is try and give a bit of an insight in terms of my career journey and also what I have learnt on the way and some tips which may be helpful, but what I will say is it's unique to everybody. So what I have done might not be relevant, but I will just take you through what has worked for me. So, who am I? As per the introduction, I am chairwoman of Mediacom in the UK and Ireland, and Mediacom is the largest media agency in the UK. You are one of my clients, so Tesco is one of my clients, along with other brands such as Sky TV, GSK, Mars, Cancer Research UK, a whole range of different clients. And I also do a few things outside of Mediacom. So I have a core part of my DNA which is about talent is everywhere and opportunity is not. And I try and do what I can to level the playing field. And that has drawn me to a number of different organisations that I tend to work with. So I am president of our industry charity, which is NABS, which is focused on well-being and health of people working in the advertising industry, along with trying to make the business case for diversity to get people from more diverse backgrounds into advertising. I am also a board member of an organisation called Creative England, who specifically loan money to startups in the creative industry sectors. That can be anything from digital companies through to film directors through to video gamers, and a specific focus of outside of London as well to make sure stimulate growth in the regions. I am also part of the Creative Industries Federation, which is a lobbying committee to try and ensure the creative industry gets what they need from government in order to help the creative industries grow. I am a media commentator, so you might see me on Channel 4 News or ITV News or BBC News talking about events in media or other things which affect the industry. I hold 2 doctorates, one from Reading University and one from my old university, which is Portsmouth. That's me dressed up looking like an extra from Harry Potter with Sandy Toksvig. And in November, I take over from Sandy as Chancellor of the University of Portsmouth. 25 years after I graduated, I go back as Chancellor. And I received an OBE in 2014 from the Queen for services to media and communications. I'm also a single mum of the most energetic 7-year-old boy that there is, so I am knackered, basically. So, my career journey. So I sort of entered the advertising industry in the early 90s. And it was something that I was really passionate about from a very, very early age. And from a very early age, I enjoyed the ads as much as I did the TV programmes. I genuinely did. And I could remember my favourite TV ads, and I had a view about whether or not I thought they were any good from the earliest age. And I could remember the sonic triggers and the jingles in some of the ads. And so I was fascinated by this world. But I had no clue how to even enter that world because it was something that was just so different from my background and from my family. And when I graduated from Portsmouth, this is what the industry looked like in terms of the leaders and the movers and the shakers running all of the top media agencies and all of the top advertising agencies in the early 90s. And that was me. As I left university, looking very different to the people that were running all of the agencies. So I could have had an alternative career as an impersonator from Pepsi and Pepsi and Shirley, but I decided I wanted to go into advertising, and I had some concerns because I couldn't see anybody that looked like me in the industry. Now, this is a famous quote from Kimberly Crenshaw, who is an activist in the US who talks a lot about social commentary about race in the US. And she talks a lot about intersectionality, which is when you come from a minority background and you have intersectionality, so a crossover of 2 different minorities. So as you saw from that slide previously, it tended to be lots of white middle-aged men that were running the industry. And the one woman that was there probably had more balls than all the rest of the blokes put together, but I was very different to her as well. So being a female and being black was going to be a barrier or a perceived barrier based on who already was in the industry. And Deloitte University, a few years ago now, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, created a study of a range of different businesses, loads of different industry sectors, and they interviewed people of all different hierarchy, different job titles, and all different types of people. And they coined this phrase, which is covering, which was in order to progress at work, you you try and fit in with what is the perceived mainstream. So you suppress some of your natural traits to try and progress at work, to fit in with what is perceived as the mainstream. And 61% of people, based on this survey, actually cover. So covering at work. So 61% of people sitting in this room are probably suppressing something natural to them in order to try and fit in with their other team members or people at work. And that increases to 66% for women and increases to 83% for people that identified as gay. So this is a choice that I had to make. So I could cover and try and pretend to fit in with what was the mainstream for the advertising industry. But to be honest, I'm perfectly happy being a woman, and skin bleaching was not an option that I was looking to do. So it's about how I could find my way and my path in an industry which looked very different to me. And there's a thing that we don't like to say out very loud in my industry, in the advertising industry, which is that consumers aren't actually interested in advertising. They are more interested in their own stories rather than listening to a brand story. And it's something that we need to remember in my industry, that consumers aren't naturally seeking out ads. They're not as interested as I was when I was younger growing up, that I was really fascinated by the advertising. We have seen a dramatic decrease in people paying attention to TV ads. If you went back 30 years, it was almost 100% of the ads in the ad break that people watched and consumed. Now that's dropped to more like 20 to 30%. People are busy living their own lives and listening to their own stories and their friends' stories rather than listening to brand stories. And the more that my industry develops technology to try and find consumers and find where they are and talk about a particular brand, consumers have got technology to try and avoid the advertising that I'm trying to put in front of them. So almost 21% of adults in the UK have installed ad blockers on their computers so that they don't see ads. So you've got over 10 million people trying to avoid messages which I'm trying to send. So consumers have got technology too. So what's really important is making sure that any brand story that anybody in the advertising industry creates and puts in front of a consumer actually reflects the life of the consumer. And this is a brilliant quote from a Nobel Prize winner, and this is so true, that if the story isn't about the reader, they will not listen. And this is something which would help me be relevant to going into the advertising industry. So if we think about the UK today, and I talk a lot about the UK being a fantastic fruit salad of people, because it is, it's a brilliant fruit salad of people now. And you've got 1 in 4 kids in primary and secondary school come from a BAME background. So those are future consumers. And you have cities like Birmingham, which is the first majority city in the UK. And the rest of the UK is probably going to be as diverse as London is, where you've got almost 40% of the consumers in London from a BAME background by 2045. So the rest of the UK, 45% of the consumers will come from a BAME background. These are future and current consumers. But in my industry, currently only 19% of the ads that you see actually feature anybody from a BAME background. Women, and I think about women and how crucial women are. If the economy had a gender, it would be female, because 83% of all consumer purchases are made by women. And categories which have predominantly been associated with men, 52% of all car purchases are made by women, 55% of all computer purchases are made by women, 93% of all grocery shopping is made by women. So women are pretty relevant. So I'm relevant because I'm black, because that's current consumers, and I'm a woman, so I'm actually know about shopping. And that can help me advise brands who are looking at targeting consumers. But if you look at advertising, currently only 33% of ads that you will see feature women in a lead role, only 33%. And that tends to be women cast for their beauty or women cast in a domestic situation as a mum. So only 33% feature women. So again, it's making sure that there is relevance in terms of advising the advertising industry, advising brands that I work with to make sure that they're relevant, because people want to see their story reflected in a brand story. So part of what I needed to make sure that I could do to make sure I was successful in my chosen field in advertising was to make sure that I knew my own brand, to make sure that that relevance that I knew I had could be seen by people working in the industry, what relevance I could bring, and making sure that they knew what my personal brand is. Now, there's a management thinker called Peter Drucker who about 20 years ago came up with a very simple technique in order to make sure that people could define their personal brand. And a brand only exists in other people's heads. And it's really important. So whatever the next job is that you want to go for, whether it's the next promotion, whether it's another company, the next role it is that you want to go for, it's really important that people know your personal brand. Because these may be people that are making a decision about you who don't necessarily work with you on a day-to-day basis and might not know the work that you've created that it's associated with you. So making sure that people know your brand and know what you're good at is really important. So Peter Drucker came up with these really simple 4 questions that if you can answer these, you never have to wait for somebody in an HR team to tell you what your job should be or give you a job description, because it's your job to tell your team, tell your manager what your role should be based on these 4 questions. And this is something that I've done. So this has changed and evolved as my experience in the industry has moved on. But these 4 questions are really important. So what is it that you're good at? How do you tend to work? What your values are? And then the contribution that you plan to make to any company that you work in, and then the results that you should be expected to deliver because of that. So if you can answer those 4 questions, you will always have a role, because that's your personal brand. So I'm going to take you through a little bit about my background, and then I will take you through my own personal statement and how I got to it based on me. And it's got to be unique and specific to you. So I grew up in Reading, which was known as Mini Barbados, because loads of people from Barbados in the 60s sort of descended on Reading when all the recruiters came to Barbados, because they had a big hospital, and it was where the post office, which became BT, had one of their main branches. So my mum and dad came over from Barbados when they were both 19. And my mum trained as a nurse, and then she worked as a nurse in the hospital for 45 odd years. My dad came over and for the first year worked on the buses as a bus conductor, and then he trained, got an apprenticeship with the post office and became an electrical engineer. So there were lots of people that at that time, I was surrounded by brilliant family and friends, but there were lots of people that I was at school when I went to careers advisors. And I asked, you know, what was it that I could do? I'm good at X, I'm good at Y, what sort of jobs could I do? And the 2 options that they said to me were teacher or nurse. So that's what they saw for somebody who was a black girl growing up in Reading. The 2 opportunities for me were to become either a teacher or nurse, both of which are brilliant professions, but neither of which were ones that I wanted to do. But that's all they saw, that limitation. And I know my mum and dad have been absolutely instrumental in part of my DNA and some of the things that I do and I say now to my son. And my dad used to say to me, you are black, you are female, you are going to have to try twice as hard as anyone else just to get on a level playing field. And I remember that, and I did, and I absolutely did. So I remember where I came from, but I didn't let it stereotype me. So what my dad also used to tell me was to celebrate my differences, because it would make me memorable. Because going into that industry where it was a sea of white men, I was different, and I celebrated that difference because it made me memorable. So when I had to go into organisations and pitch for new bits of business, Oh, that was the agency with the black girl that pitched, wasn't it? It made me memorable. Hopefully I didn't say anything ridiculous, and I was memorable for the right reasons, but I celebrated my differences. And that's something, rather than being worried about not fitting in, feeling the need to cover, I had the confidence to be able to celebrate difference and use it to my advantage. But not everybody celebrates difference, and not everybody is accepting of difference. And I remember during my career, when I was a business director, so a fair few years ago, and I was the person that when we pitched for a piece of business, I would be the person that if we won the account, I would coordinate all of the advertising activity. So I'd be the core person that the client would have to buy. And I remember we were pitching for a piece of business and we didn't win that piece of business. And it's a small industry that I work in and everybody knows each other. And I knew the winning agency and I knew the person that was going to be the equivalent role in the winning agency. And as you do, and I would have done exactly the same thing, they took the client out to dinner to say thank you for winning the business, and they used it as an opportunity to fact find and find out what all the competition did, to find out what all the other agencies presented and what they said, because you need to know your competition. And it was two middle-aged white men that were the core decision makers. And they sort of said, oh, you know, well, the agency that I worked at the time, well, they were quite good. Actually, they were really good. But there's no way we would have had a female business director, let alone a black one. And that was the feedback that they gave. And to say that that didn't hurt, I would be lying, because of course it hurt, because that's personal, because that's about me. It's not about the work, it's not about the presentation, that was about me as an individual. And I got really angry and I was really upset, and I thought I'd lost the agency a piece of business because of me. But then again, I don't want to change my gender. I'm really happy being a woman. I don't want to try and pretend that I'm white. I'm not, I'm black. I'm really proud of where I've come from. And I have to let that anger go, because the only person that was getting upset was me. And I do believe in karma as well, because less than a year later, those two individuals were removed from that company. So I do believe in karma. So this is something that I refer back to a lot, which is not holding on to anger when something happens, because not everybody will be accepting of difference. What has helped me as well is finding a team of cheerleaders and sponsors, because again, anybody that sort of stands here and says that it's been plain sailing and that their career's been brilliant is not necessarily telling the truth. There are always highs and lows, and you need cheerleaders and sponsors to help you remember who you are, remember what you're good at, and to get you back on track, and to give you that verbal slap that you might need when you're lacking in confidence or lacking in self-belief. And I've been fortunate to have some amazing cheerleaders. And I see commentary like this, which was recent from the Hampton Alexander report. So you may have seen recently about the BBC publishing their talent list and the pay for the top talent. And out of the 96, there were only 24 women in that talent list, and of that total list, there were only 10 people of colour in terms of the top paid talent. And this was a commentary by somebody that's an advisor to the government, saying that it's women's fault, basically, that they had got themselves into this situation. And what you need, and you know, Philip Hampton is a very bright man, but it's not women's fault. Yes, there is some responsibility, but it's also the conditions of the organisation as well. And you need cheerleaders and sponsors to help you. And that's been really important to me. So I've been blessed with having some amazing cheerleaders. So this lady here on the left, my Chief Transformation Officer at Mediacom, when I started at the agency, she was a cheerleader for me. The previous chairwoman, Jane Ratcliffe, who's now the Vice President of our sports practice at the agency. The apprentices, Claudine Collins, she's one of the judges on the Apprentice. She's my Managing Director. We both started together in my very first agency, so Claude has been a massive cheerleader, and me, her. My boss, Nick Lawson, who runs Mediacom across Europe, Middle East and Africa, probably doesn't even realise I'm a woman or black. He just cares about winning, and that's what he sees me as, somebody that just wants to win. And I've had a life coach for 15 years. So the guy at the end is my life coach, a guy called Adrian Green that runs a company called Pressure Point. And I have found it invaluable for me to have a life coach, somebody that I can go to, that can be objective, that knows me, knows the industry I work in. He's an British athlete, so he understands how I work, because I used to do a lot of athletics when I was younger, so very focused as well. So it's been invaluable to me. What's been important to me as well is actually having cheerleaders from my own community as well, because they've also experienced some of the things that I have as part of their careers. So these are my cheerleaders from outside the industry, some of them within the industry, but what we share is a background in terms of our ethnicity and also how they've handled it as well. And I do say that Diane Abbott did not ring me before she had to do that LBC radio interview. Otherwise, I would have given her some good advice. One of the other things I think which has helped me come up with my personal statement is that I'm quite T-shaped. So throughout my career in the advertising industry, I have purposely done a range of different roles. So I have not had a trajectory which has just been straight up. I have purposely gone into lots of different roles so that I can really understand the engine of an agency. So I haven't always looked for a direct promotion. I've done lots of different things into different departments. And that meant that when I did become a leader, when I did become a CEO, I've probably done most of the roles within an agency, which means that I can build empathy with the people in those departments doing those roles. I know how those roles are done, so I understand what they're going through. So I think that has made me a better leader, because I've done lots of different roles to allow me to have that breadth of knowledge. This is one I say depending on the age of the group, and I think I might have to change this, so you all look quite young. So what I normally say is make sure that you're Gladys Knight and not a Pip. So for the younger audience, make sure you're Beyonce and not one of the other Destiny's Childs that no one can remember. And this is about when it is your opportunity, make sure that you step forward and that you sing. Make sure you have a voice. My dad used to say to me a lot, 2 ears, 1 mouth, use them in that proportion, which is make sure that you listen and that you learn. But then when it's your opportunity, make sure you step forward and speak up. It's really important so that people get to know what your brand is. In around about 2007, 2008, I stepped out of the UK and I did a role across Europe, Middle East and Africa. So I became the Chief Operation Officer for Europe, Middle East and Africa, and it was the first time that I'd moved outside of the UK or worked properly outside of the UK. And I had some priority markets. So I had Russia, I had Poland, I had the Czech Republic, I had South Africa, I had Turkey, France, Spain were the markets that I was going to a lot. And it's taught me a lot about leadership, because I wasn't any of the CEOs that ran those markets' boss. I couldn't fire them, but I needed to get them to join in. I needed to get them to do what I needed to create a better agency network. And that's how I learnt how to shape my style, about building a coalition, about leadership is sometimes from the front, from the middle and from behind. That it's not always you charging ahead. Sometimes you're part of the team, sometimes you're at the back pushing other people forward. And that's how I've learnt to make sure that I tend to be quite open and collaborative in my style. My office at the agency, I don't actually have an office. It tends to be a long dining room table with lots of chairs around it, because I like people to come and sit and work with me. So I don't have a desk. It is a dining room table with lots of chairs around it. I've got the equivalent of bifold kitchen extension doors, which I fold back, so I sit open plan. When I have to have the odd private meeting, the bifold doors gets closed, but otherwise I sit open plan. And that tends to be the style which works for me, and it's a style that I've tended to develop, that I get people to come with me. Whilst I was doing my EMEA role, I met the man of my dreams. I very quickly became engaged, and I very quickly became pregnant. I then very quickly realised he was not the man of my dreams. And I then decided to go it alone. And 9 months after having my son, I then got promoted to run the largest office in the Mediacom network, which is the UK office. And that was not expected in terms of having my son. I didn't plan to be a single mum at all. but I've always been ambitious and I've always been driven. And what was key to me as part of my journey was you can't plan everything. Sometimes you just can't plan everything. And you then need to know when to ask for help. So in order to do a really good role as a mum and a really good role as CEO of the office, it meant that I couldn't do it all. I'm not Superwoman. So I set out my stall. I had conversations with people internally about how I would work and also externally with clients and people that I work with. And what was really important was that people knew I was just as ambitious, just as driven, just as productive as I've always been, probably more productive because I've got other things to do once I leave the office, but I was just going to work in a slightly different way. So I tend to get in slightly later, I might tend to leave slightly earlier, but outside of the office, I'm doing things. So I tend to leave the office or try to leave the office around about 5:30, 6 o'clock so I can get home and be with my son and go through whatever bit of homework it is or go through reading with him, and then I'll turn on again. I'll switch back on again after about 7:30, 8 o'clock. I'm on again and I'll answer emails or I'll do conference calls. I just work in a different way to I used to. But I had to have that conversation with people that I worked with and also know when to delegate as well and ask for help because I cannot do it all. I said earlier that I am quite competitive and I stand here as a failed athlete because actually that was my first love. I ran for my club, ran for my university and competed internationally as well. So I was a sprinter and a long jumper. And that made me quite good at being quite focused. So I could win the 100 metres in the first 30 metres if my start was good. And I used to practice my start on my blocks over and over again with my coach. But also it meant that I was good getting feedback. So my dad always used to be standing at the end of a long jump pitch with his camera taking photos. And when the photos were developed, there was always a critique about where my landing leg was, how I took off. And it made me open to feedback, and it's something that I actually go and seek now because it means that I will get better. Something that I am absolutely a champion of, and I think that's why they gave me the OBE to shut me up, is about making sure that I champion diversity because it just creates better creativity, better innovation, more productivity. It's more painful to get to the end result because you've got lots of people that are different, but the end result is absolutely better. So I talk a lot about always working in a team where there's an Avengers assemble of people because everybody's got a superhero skill and it's about how the superheroes come together as a team. So this is my personal statement. So what I tend to be good at, my dad's saying 2 ears, 1 mouth. It's literally finding what the real problems are, hearing the whispers in all the noise that's out there, making sure that I connect people from all different walks of life. Of all the different roles that I do, I tend to meet lots of different people. When you connect them, magic can happen. I'm good at leading large teams and large diverse teams and wanting to win and stay ahead of the competition. I tend to work quite passionately because I love what I do. I tend to have a smile on my face even when things are going horribly wrong. I don't want everybody thinking the boat's going down, so there's a smile on my face to keep going. But I am very, very focused. I am incredibly organised because there's lots of stuff that I do, and I will make sure that I blend my work with my family life. So you see pictures of my son all over the place because that's part of my blend. I ban the word work-life balance at the office and I talk about work-life blend because work is life and life is work. My values: be respectful, make sure you celebrate difference, keep it real, remember where you come from, be kind, make sure that you always cheerlead others, work hard but make sure that you can have some fun as well. And then finally, what it is, the contribution that I plan to make, it's making organisations that I work with more diverse. By doing that, they become more dynamic. By doing that, you have people that are happy because they can bring themselves to work. And that means you foster a winning culture. I make sure that the organisations that I work at become a beacon for talent. And because I do roles outside of the agency, so I'm one of 40 business ambassadors for Number 10, so I encourage export and foreign direct investment to the UK, and I also advise the civil service in terms of race and how you diversify the civil service. So that means that the UK becomes an investment on the world stage. That's something that I like doing. And finally, because I am competitive, whatever organisation it is I work in, I want to try and create a company that wins. So my personal statement or my personal brand, I summarise as head performance coach. I have a coaching style of management. It is about performance, and I tend to like to be the person that's doing it, so advising and helping, so sitting at the top as the head. Now, by doing all of that, apparently just by being yourself, and this is our industry magazine, where they got other leaders of all the other organisations and agencies to vote on who they admired the most. Apparently it was me, and I'm a new breed of leader. So I am a new breed of leader when you compare it back to that very first slide that you showed at the beginning of what the industry looked like when I entered. But a new breed of leader just by being yourself, not by doing anything else, not by covering, just by being yourself. And I would say that I am a real model as well. So when I took over being CEO in the UK in 2011, 11% of our agency came from a BAME background. 5 years later, when I moved to become chairwoman, it had almost doubled to 19% because people could see someone that looked like me and believed it was possible to have a career in the industry. This is what the industry looks like now, a very different picture to what it was before. But there is still only 8% of our most senior roles, executive roles in the industry that is from anybody from a Black, Asian or minority ethnic background. So there is still a lot of work to be done, especially when you compare it to the stats about what the UK is now and who we should be talking and advertising to. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that. Can you just talk to us a little bit more about cheerleading and kind of how you got people to cheerlead you and how you cheerlead others?
Yeah, and that's an interesting one because it's not a formal process. So it's most of those people on that slide I have met through the course of work or socially at events, and we have just got on because I think there has to be chemistry there. And I've been at a number of things where people come up and say, can you mentor me or cheerlead me? And I think that's weird because I don't know who you are. You don't know me. So all of those cheerleaders are people that I have met on a panel or at an event or at a conference or at a party or whatever it is, and there's been chemistry. There's been some commonality and we've got on. And they don't even know that they've become my cheerleaders, but they're people that I ring up and ask for advice, and then they end up doing the same for me. So it's not formal at all. Whereas a sponsor, that has been more formal, and it's normally somebody within the organisation that can be in the meetings to talk on my behalf when I'm not there and talk about my output, which is slightly more formal and slightly different. But cheerleaders, I collect all the time from people that I meet doing different events.
How do you reconcile celebrating differences and adapting to the local culture?
It's an interesting one because I think everybody has got their own story. And I think everybody's got their own unique experiences. And I think there always has to be a cultural filter on what you do. But I think everybody's own story, there's always a nugget of insight that you've not thought about before. There was something in our industry called the Great British Diversity Experiment, which put teams of people from different backgrounds, different abilities together to come up and solve a brief for Tesco, actually. So the brief that they all looked at was a Tesco brief about food waste. So you had people that were able-bodied, you had people with disabilities, people who were gay, people who were straight, all different backgrounds. And what we saw from that experiment was how people had different cultural cues would bring different insights about food and how people ate, what people did about whether or not you recycle food, whether you had leftovers, whether you just threw it away. And that you had to look at it in the lens of the UK, but different people from lots of different backgrounds just talking about what happens with food in their country actually brought some amazing insights, which I think you guys are actually using, actually, the winning team. So I think it's about hearing other people's stories can actually lead to insight, but then looking at whether or not that can work within the culture that you operate in. I think it's more about trying to find and uncover those nuggets of insight that can work. And I think insight sometimes can be universal. It doesn't really matter where you're from. It can be universal, and that's the thing. I don't know if that answers your question, Rona.
Hi, that was really inspiring stuff.
Thank you.
What do you think remains the biggest barriers to achieving diversity in the workplace, and how are we going to overcome it?
I think there's, whether we like it or not, conscious and unconscious bias exists. People like to hire in their own mirror image. So I think there is something about awareness of what your bias may be. Because some people, people aren't doing it on purpose. They're just not aware of it. So I think there needs to be a program about people recognising what their bias is and at least being aware of it. I think there's things that we have to do in terms of pipeline to make sure that when you're looking at recruiting at the lowest levels, that you're getting a diverse range of candidates coming in. I think there's always a squeeze in the middle as well, so people that are already in an organisation churning out because they think there's just not enough people above that are like them and that they can't progress. So there's a focus on the churn in the middle as well, and that's where cheerleading and sponsoring comes in, and mentoring to make sure that people stay within an organisation. But there's also how you interview as well to make sure you get that pipeline right. So I always talk about you've got to be focused on having representative shortlists. So whatever the diversity is that you want to increase, make sure that you have representative candidate shortlists, and make sure that you do panel interviews as well, so that you have a range of people from different backgrounds actually doing the interviews, that you get diversity in terms of people having different thought processes interviewing a candidate that's coming in the first place, to make sure that that mirror image thing doesn't continue. So I think there's a range of different things that can be done. It's not just one silver bullet.